This is John Lauder, host of The Cheap Seats. Thanks for listening to the following broadcast on Public House Media.
Strike three, you're out. Welcome to a brand new episode of Caught Listening, the baseball podcast that goes beyond the white lines as we are here at the end of April 2020, what would have been the first full month of baseball, and we certainly hope everybody is staying safe. We hope they are staying healthy and that we are getting ready for baseball here, hopefully in 2020. Now, many shows that you listen to, many podcasts that you subscribe to are probably at this point discussing ways to get baseball back and how baseball might look following COVID-19. However, if you've been listening to this show, you know that we're talking about more than just that. And today we're talking about a man who passed away in the last week, who really was kind of the embodiment of a living legend and whose stories lay claim to one of the greatest, in my opinion, baseball movies of all time. And we are very fortunate. We're talking about Steve Dalkowski, who led credence to Nuke LaLoosh of Bull Durham, portrayed by Tim Robbins. But he was so much more than that. And a lot of people, what's great is, they're learning about him now. It's unfortunate it's after his passing. But we are very fortunate to have a gentleman who spoke with him a couple of times throughout his life and knows what his career was from a baseball standpoint. The former New York Times sports columnist and I'm proud to say a fellow Hofstra University alum. I don't think it's an understatement to say the legendary Mr. George Vescey is joining us, sir. We really do appreciate it.
I'm a legend in my own mind, as the saying goes. But thank you.
Well, we really do. Yeah.
So there is actually a Hofstra connection to Steve Dalkowski. I was talking to my friend Jerry Rosenthal, who was the all-Met Conference shortstop back when Hofstra belonged to a really great conference in the metropolitan area, St. John's, and et cetera. And Jerry was the all-conference shortstop for a couple of years, and he got out a year after me, and he went right into the minor leagues. He signed with the Milwaukee Braves. And he said that when he got to minor league camp, and the players who'd been up in the minor leagues for a couple of years, Jerry was new to this, they started talking about this guy Dalkowski. And Jerry said, "What do you mean?" Guy said, "Well, I was in South Dakota in the A-League, and we had to face him, and he threw so hard. Fortunately, he threw mostly outside the plate rather than in." And Jerry said that these guys all swore he threw like over 105 miles per hour. There was no way to measure it in those days, the early 60s. Mm-hmm. But they were in such awe of Dalkowski. And finally, Jerry saw him, didn't bat against him in the 2 years that he was in the minors, but he was aware of it, and he said the guy really was. And of course, I saw Dalkowski in the spring of 1963.
It's incredible to think of this, but one of the things that always is amazing for baseball is, and it's still to this day, Aroldis Chapman being able to throw 104, whatever it might be. Randy Johnson, the idea of being able to throw over 100 miles an hour. And here's this gentleman who decades ago, many people believe still to be the fastest pitcher ever. But it's so incredible because there are things you can and can't teach. You might be able to teach strength and velocity, but you can't exactly teach accuracy. And that was one of Dalkowski's issues.
Well, that's coaches always say that you can't coach speed, or you can't coach height, or all the great cliches. But in this case, that's pretty much all that he had. We've all seen pitchers come along who throw so hard, but their lifestyle or their personality or their intelligence doesn't match what's in their arm or their bat or whatever it is. Matt Harvey, what happened to him? Mm-hmm. I don't know, and I don't claim to know. But you see people who are just sensational for a year or three. And then Steve Blass, my friend Jerry was talking about Steve Blass, who was sort of in the majors at a time when Jerry was aspiring to it. He said the guy, one year he's like helping to win the World Series, and he's an all-star, and the next year he can't find home plate. But in Dalkowski's case, he didn't even have the yips or he didn't get confused. He didn't lose the motion. He just was a ne'er-do-well in every sense of the word, except when he'd throw the ball and it would go, 105 or whatever it was.
And you said you had a chance to see him. When you think back and you look at him and you see how baseball's progressed, is he was he the fastest, the hardest thrower ever that you've seen?
Well, I'd have to say I think maybe I only saw him throw one inning. I can't find my Newsday. I was working for Newsday at the time, and I wasn't covering the game. It was a Saturday night game in Miami Stadium, and I was with the Mets. They were down on the the South Coast for a couple of days, and the Yankees had the game at night, and I went down there, I think on my own. I don't believe I was writing that night. I don't believe I wrote afterward because I was catching up with the Mets the next day somewhere. But I just wanted to see the Yankees and see. So there's Dalkowski coming into. I don't even think he started the game. I think he came in the third or fourth inning or whatever it was, and he pitched maybe one inning, maybe. Then he hurt his elbow somehow or other. He hurt his elbow in that game. So I saw him on the last, the last time he threw that hard. He stayed around for a couple more years just because they kept trying to revive him.
Right.
So it's really hard to say. The lights were terrible there. And I remember, all you had to do if you're used to major league lights. In spring training, you see some pretty bad A-leagues in those days, particularly. You see some pretty bad lighting situations in the minor leagues. But I don't think that we looked at the night and how bad it was, and you couldn't see anybody. And for him to come in throwing as fast as he did, and the Yankees, who of course had won the World Series, had won the pennant the year before. No, they had won the World Series, and they were perennial champions, and they were so confident. They had all these monsters, and I just remember they were waving at the ball. That was very clear. They didn't want any part of it. They had nothing to gain. It was already mid-March, and the season was going to start in a couple of weeks, and they weren't getting hurt for anything. So they were all just waving at it. And then when they all struck out, I think it was 3 up and 3 down. I'm sure it was. They got back to the dugout, and the guys were making fun of him in the dugout. And then after the game, I did go down to the Yankee. Dalkowski was nowhere around. I remember that he'd either gone to for care of his elbow, whatever it was. So I didn't get to talk to him that night. But I remember the Yankees, and we're talking about Roger Maris, Johnny Blanchard, who was a regular but third, second string catcher, but he was, and I said Clete Boyer was there, and Elston Howard, who was one of the most inside guys on the team by then, and they were just making fun of each other. The three guys who'd gone up and gone down. Like, did you see the way you waved? You were standing so far. Classic. You've been around ball players and professionals, and you know how vicious, but understandable. These guys all speak the same language, which is sarcasm and putting people down. But it's part of their professionalism, and they all admitted, I chickened out. I wasn't about to get hit by that guy. Well, so it was a phenomenon.
I love it because there's this art, and again, Steve Dalkowski passed away last week at the age of 80 due to the coronavirus pandemic. But I was reading through all these articles and people remembering him, and then articles from further back about him as a player and things like that. And you had one in the New York Times in July of 2009 when he was inducted into the Shrine of the Eternals. And what I love is the second, or the third paragraph. You're talking about Dalkowski and Roger Maris and how they met in that game in March in 1963. And the line here is, when they met, Maris was theoretically standing near home plate in Miami, but his fanny was more or less in the Bahamas. And if that doesn't give you a description as to how far...
I think I got the geography right, because a left-handed hitter would be facing east, the way most ballparks are configured. And thank goodness I got it right. I didn't have him facing the Gulf of Mexico.
But I mean, that's just the most pure of descriptions, is to just, and you can imagine Roger Maris just leaning over as far away to be able to bail out if 110 mile an hour comes at him, and he doesn't want to. And that's the thing with this legend is the fact that it's not just Roger Maris. There's stories of how Ted Williams just stood in there for 2 pitches and was like, nope, I'm out. Arguably one of the greatest hitters of all time.
Oh, Ted wasn't fooling around. He just wanted to see it up close, and he didn't want to try and swing at it. I mean, Plus, I think he was not playing anymore. But even at that, most guys would have. I mean, I'm sure that Roger Maris, if he could have, would have peeled off a couple of hundreds and found some kid from Double A or Triple A on the Yankee dugout that night and said, "Kid, how'd you like to go up and hit for me?" But Ralph Houck was not going to, put up with it. Although, I wouldn't have blamed him if he did. But I don't think Dalkowski started the game, because if they knew Dalkowski was going to start the game, they would have started their farmhands, Roger Repos or somebody, Artie Lopez, or some of the subs, and in that case they wouldn't have had to face him.
We're talking with George Vescey, the former New York Times sports columnist here, talking about Steve Dalkowski, the real life Nuke LaLoosh, if you want to call him that. This is a man who, again, the legend is there of how hard he threw and spent years in the Orioles minor league system, never actually got to the majors, and for all the skepticism or what have you regarding his ability to throw the ball hard, this was still a man with some demons in him, not only in his playing days but later on, and it took some time for him to start to really exercise those.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, he had come up in the Baltimore system. Baltimore had loaded itself with great young pitchers starting in the late 50s, and I made a list the other day. There were about 6 or 7 of them. Jerry Walker, Milt Pappas, Steve Barber, Chuck Estrada, and Bo Belinsky, who had a couple of quite good years. I think pitched a no-hitter or something in his one good year. And all these guys were crazy. And in spring training, they told stories about how they'd go down for breakfast in the minor league cafeteria, and they'd be drinking from water glasses, but the clear stuff they were drinking was not water at all, but it was vodka. And that was just the way those guys rolled. Most of them managed to have good careers or even terrific careers in the major leagues. Dalkowski was the one in 6 or 7 that just, once he was on that pathway of drinking, and I have a lot of friends who are AA members and, talk to me. I did a book with Bob Welch, the baseball player who was an alcoholic and, reforming, but they say it found me. I knew that this was my thing, when they started to drink. And for Dalkowski, I don't think he ever beat it. I think they finally got him into a home when he was like 60 years old. His sister found him. He was picking vegetables out in California somewhere, and she got him back into Connecticut and got him into a home. And he'd been there by the time I did that column on him in 2009. He'd been in this home for 10 or 15 years. And the man who ran it, a very nice man, I only talked to him on the phone, but he talked about how they knew what they had. They knew this guy had a backstory. In fact, they'd even tried to connect him with the Orioles at one point, taking a bunch of guys down by bus to a game or something. But Dalkowski just, he discovered out. I mean, some people discover alcohol at 10 or 12 or something like that. Well, whatever it was, he was just addicted to it, couldn't get away from it, and probably baseball wasn't sophisticated enough. I mean, it was still 10 years, 20 years away from ball players going into rehab. You never heard of rehab. But then Porter, the catcher for the Kansas City, and my friend Bob Welch, and Lou Johnson, who's God bless him, I believe is still alive, and he got through the Meadows. So ball players in the late 70s and early 80s were starting to go through the treatment center and realize what they had going on, but nobody ever reached Dalkowski. They probably had him on medication in the home, and they wouldn't allow him to drink, and et cetera, et cetera. But it was a disease, and he had it.
And you almost wonder too, because you mentioned it earlier. Prior, in that game in 1963, he had hurt his elbow, and that was pretty much. I mean, he was able to hang on for a little bit longer in the minors, but it seems as though if he had stayed healthy, 63 could have been that year that he made the majors, based on all accounts. But you almost wonder how that could have changed things for him potentially. I mean, who knows if he gets that call and he's able to find a way to beat it, or maybe it just takes an even worse turn for him at that point.
I would say that it could very well have gotten worse, because for him to be, even if he'd made a major league roster for a while, and the other players were merciless, and many of them in those days had drank a lot. Nobody knew the difference, and it's quite likely that he would have been caught up with the the most cowboy of teammates and going out places at night and pulling stuff like drinking vodka out of a water glass and all of that. So I'd like to think it could have turned out better, but if you look at his record from the time he got into the minor leagues, anybody can find that online, Baseball Reference, they have a minor league section, and you can find his statistics are stunning in the number of strikeouts he had everywhere he went, but so were his bases on balls, and his won-loss percentage is atrocious.
Yeah.
He'd be in some team, and he'd be 1-7, and he'd wear out his welcome, and some manager would say, I ain't going to try and manage that guy. He's crazy. And they'd move him somewhere else, and they'd have old pappy guy pitching coaches would try and help him along, but he was just beyond the pale, and he just, let's put it this way, the most optimistic thing to say about him is that he was 20 years ahead of his time, that he didn't get the care. Bob Welch was drinking at the ballpark, starting fights before the game even began, out of his nose in 1979 after pitching in the World Series. And the Dodgers were connected. The parent club was sponsored by Union Oil, which had a terrific employee program. The Dodgers were hooked into that, and the Dodgers called Bob in after the season. Al Campanis, my friend Al Campanis, wonderful guy, and Don Newcomb, and maybe Lasorda. Lasorda he didn't believe it, but these guys Newcomb knew because he was an alcoholic himself. God bless him. And they said to him, Bob, we see what you're doing. Newcomb said, son, that I had to pull you out of a hallway in the hotel. You had your money in your wallet was in your hand, and you were sleeping in the hallway outside your room. And I got you into that room, and I made sure you were safe. And you can't be going on like. They scared the hell out of him. And he went, and he was a convert. He took it seriously. As far as I know, never drank again for the 20-odd years that he had left to him. And that just wasn't happening when Dalkowski came along.
Right. And you even mentioned it in that piece you wrote in 2009, because they wanted to room him in the minors with Joe Altobelli, a veteran presence who was hoping to turn him around. But as you mentioned in there, it's hard to change a roommate who's never in the room, which was Dalkowski throughout his minor league career. I just went and pulled up his stats, by the way, from Baseball Reference, and in his 9 years in the minors, 46-80 was his overall record. 1,236 walks, 1,324 strikeouts in 956 innings. So, it was impressive. The control wasn't there, and certainly, obviously, the off the field issues kept him away. But one of the things that's interesting is baseball is all about these stories, and you can connect throughout history. These great players, and the fact that we've today talking about a gentleman who never made the majors, yet we're talking about his connections to Ted Williams and Roger Maris and Cal Ripken Sr. And Earl Weaver and all these legends of the game about it. That's just an incredible part about the fabric of baseball as a whole.
Right. You could slow baseball down because of the individual plays. Everything is an individual play, and who was where, and you can trace people's careers much more than you can. I mean, the careers are much more interesting than in football. You find out that some old guard was playing one more year with another team, and I didn't know that. But in baseball, somebody comes along and has a good month. I mean, think of all the players that have come on to a team late in the season. Pete Ramos coming to the Yankees in 1964, and helping them win the pennant. Couldn't pitch in the World Series because he came too late. But you think about all these, and you can slow it down. You can say, why didn't Ramos? Because he didn't join them till after September 1st, or whatever it was. That baseball is unique in that way.
It's incredible, and it's what makes the game so much fun. We're talking with George Vescey, the New York Times sports columnist, here on Caught Listening, discussing Steve Dalkowski. And let's get to what kind of made him famous as well. And this is something that I don't think people realize, at least the younger generation certainly didn't realize until maybe this past week, 10 days with his passing. And that is that he became essentially the inspiration for Nuke LaLoosh of Bull Durham fame. And not only did he become that, but kind of the Orioles were kind of the makeshift for this Durham Bulls for Bull Durham, because Ron Shelton, as you explained in the piece in 2009, a former farmhand who didn't play with Dalkowski, but he remembers this relationship between Dalkowski and Joe Altobelli, and then Shelton goes out and writes a screenplay that includes a, wild pitcher who both wild mentally and wild with his arm, but has great talent, and then a wise old, career minor league catcher, and thus, Crash Davis, Nuke LaLoosh, and Bull Durham is born.
Right. Well, as someone who has made a living and had a great time as a journalist, I have such admiration for people who can say, yeah, those two guys, that relationship or the way that fits into it, I could write a whole screenplay about it. And Shelton, bless his heart, he was able to take these two characters and put it into a framework that he knew very well, which was minor league baseball, with baseball glittering, major leagues glittering up ahead. It's interesting. I've often wondered. I never talked to Shelton about this when I did talk to him for the article, the column, but he had players using the phrase "the show," and this was whenever that movie came out, 1994 or something like that in the late 90s, and I never heard the expression when people started to talk about it. I saw the movie. I mean, who wouldn't love a movie with Susan Sarandon?
Right.
And Costner. And I remember hearing the phrase "the show," and I never heard it. I mean, I love clubhouse, and you've been around ball players. When you go into, and I don't know whether it was true with the Ducks or not, but I know certainly in the major leagues, when a guy is cut, they say he died. And Jerry, my friend Jerry, one day got cut, and everybody said Jerry died. And I remember sitting in the Yankee dugout in the late around 1970, and somebody, Stan Bonson or somebody wandered through, and they said, "What happened to so and so?" He died, and the guy was gone, packing his locker and crying and out the door. So I just never heard the phrase "the show," and not my business. He can invent his own cliche for that setting, but the rest of it, the idea of this, baseball Annie and a wise old, classic. I knew Altobelli when he was a player. I remember him being around when I first started to cover, and as a manager, he was terrific. And I'd forgotten that he was the link to Dalkowski. But there are so many people like that around. Last year, Buck, who's with the catcher, was talking about Curt Flood, and he was lecturing, and I can't remember how it came up in the context of a contract. I guess it was the pitcher that signed with the Yankees, Cole, and he said, "I hope Cole understands, because who got him there? Who got him to wear all this money?" And he was asking guys, "Do you know who Curt Flood was?" And it was so perfect. The idea, here's a career second-string catcher. And then I asked Christy Acker, who's a friend of mine. She covers baseball for the Daily News. And she said, "No, when Buck was with the Mets, he did that to me. We were on a bus somewhere, or we were going somewhere with the team and the Mets, or in a dugout, and he said to me, 'Do you know?' I said, I knew who Curt Flood was, but the point was that it takes a wise old head like that. And very often you'll find, like in football, the offensive linemen are the wise old heads because nobody talks to them much. And in baseball, it's the catchers. They see the whole game out in front of them. And when you can talk to, I'm just trying to think of some of the great old catchers that I met, years when I was breaking in. John Roseborough and Earl Batty and guys who've been everywhere, Elrod Hendrick, and they, and their stories were wonderful.
And that's the beautiful part about that position too. I mean, it's just so much fun just listening to catchers talk, and it's part of the reason why you have some who become great managers. I mean, look at Girardi, look at Socha, look at look at throughout history, the great catchers.
Yeah.
The one question I always have with Bull Durham, and I think I don't know how many people have raised it now, is, well, there was a real life Nuke LaLoosh, there was a real life Crash Davis. I want to know who the real life Annie Savoy was, but that's
I don't think you lack for them in baseball.
You certainly do not.
I certainly as a writer, you wouldn't know anything about that. But if you observe a little bit, there's a new book out, and darn if I can't remember the name, and it might be Emily something is her name, and she's written a book about. Oh, I'm sorry, it's called the Cactus League, and it's about ball players and baseball Annies and the people that make their living in and around baseball in Arizona in spring training. It's Arizona is the place. And all these women and the players' wives, and then there are the baseball aunties who obviously sit in different sections, and the players have their own problems, and not just including women trouble, but gambling and whatever. And it really does touch on the I can't say the dark side of it, but the other side of baseball.
Right. There's a different side to it, especially at the minor league level, and especially as portrayed in that movie. And I think it brought a lot of things to light that maybe people didn't understand about minor league baseball and off the field at that point in time. George, we're coming up towards a point in the show where we let our listeners get involved and ask some questions. And so I'd love to, and we just kind of give some quick hitting responses back and forth here. So I'd like to ask this first one that came to us. Outside of Steve Dalkowski, is there another legendary figure in baseball that maybe the mainstream people haven't heard of?
So you're asking me.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, everybody talks about players who had so much talent and didn't realize it. Didn't realize it in their careers. They just didn't make it. And other guys that go on. So there is that evaluation of somebody who had so much more to give. I mean, people talk. I'm trying to think about a legendary. I mean, the Mets had a guy in spring training one year, Jerry Hinsley, who was like 20 years old, and he threw really fast. He was from New Mexico or Arizona somewhere. Nice-looking kid, about 20 years old, and he wound up pitching for the Mets for Casey for like a year or two. Casey called him the Youth of America. But even though he had this reputation, that he never lived up to it. Grover Powell, who actually pitched a two-hit shutout in Connie Mack Stadium one year, and then he never could match it again, and he was out of the major leagues by the end of the season. And Casey loved the game he pitched, and again, the Youth of America. But these people have a legend to them that one day they were able to do this or able to do that. And then some of the legends are true or not true, and they're used to frighten people. For example, Bob Veal, V-E-A-L-E, was a left-handed pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates. I believe he pitched in the 1960 World Series against the Yankees. And when the Mets were formed in 1962, Veal was still in the league, but he wasn't doing as well. And one of the guys on the Mets who had been with the Pirates, and it might have been my friend Joe Christopher, who was an outfielder who never really got much of a chance, but Joe is a great guy. And somebody told the story in the Mets dugout, 1962, and said, he's blind. He can't see. You watch him. He wears these big glasses and he can't see. And somebody said, Veal was warming up, and he took out this big bandana, and he rubbed his glasses, and he kind of stumbled off the mound, and he was pretending like he was blind and stuff. And the guy, I'm not going to swing against him. Now, he couldn't have been blind because he wound up having a reasonable career in the majors. But all the lines that go on, the lies and the make-believe stuff, or things to scare people, or ball players, what do they have time to do? Half the game, they're sitting in the dugout, or in the bullpen,
and
they're making up stories. So I'm sure there are more. I'm just not coming up with somebody that everybody talked about, either in a positive way or a negative way. But so many players don't make it in the majors, and yet they come up, and people are saying can't miss. I mean, the Yankees signed a guy named Brian Taylor. He was their first big bonus baby of a new era, and he never made it anywhere near the major leagues.
Yeah. Well, and then I want to ask you this too, because part of this was the whole inspiration, Steve being the inspiration for Nuke LaLoosh. And yet, for me personally, that movie to me is still more about Crash Davis and this veteran trying to hang on and eventually deciding it's time to go into the next phase of his career, which is managing. And I've always wondered this, is there a guy like that, a career minor league home run guy, or just a great presence? And is there anyone you could think of that kind of resembles what Crash Davis was in the movie?
I mean, Crash Davis was a great minor league player, and I don't think he ever got to the majors. Is that correct? Is your memory? So he'd never been up there.
Right.
I mean, and there are players like that never quite. I mean, we're wondering now whether the Mets guy, the football player, whether he's ever going to give him a chance. And now it's much more show business and money invested and all of that. But there were players. I know that Steve Greenberg, who's the son of Hank Greenberg.
Yeah.
Now Steve was a terrific player at Yale, a very smart, very astute, and he played in the minors. And the Tigers never, I believe it was the Tigers, maybe no, couldn't have been because that was his dad's team. But the team never brought him up. Steve never got to the major leagues. And in AAA, he certainly had, if somebody had wanted to, they could have. And there was a guy I know for a fact from my part of the woods in Jamaica, Queens, named George Calif, who was a terrific player. And I can't remember where he went to college, but he too had good AAA. I mean, there's no reason why George couldn't have gotten 10 or 20 games at the end of a season, but the team that had him just never brought him up, and he kind of wound up never playing, and he became an agent and passed very young. But you think about people like that. You see so many fringe players coming up in early in the season or late in September when the rosters traditionally have been loaded with players, and they get a chance to play. The Orioles last year brought up a guy, minor league guy. He was in late 20s, and they let him play 8 or 10 games in the outfield just because. And that's a very nice thing to do. But there are some who never make it, and yet you would have thought they would. But how could you not bring Steve Greenberg, Hank Greenberg's son, with impeccable credentials? I mean, now the guy's making a ton of money, putting deals together for stadiums and players and all of that. But how could you not? I mean, it's almost cruel and stupid, but nevertheless.
Yeah, now Steve, let's see here, AAA in for 4 of his 5 years in the minors was in AAA and hit 277. So in those. So completely agree there. Mr. Vescey, we appreciate the time so much. And before I let you go, how are you doing? How's the family? How's it with all of this that's going on right now? How are you guys all doing up there?
Well, I appreciate you asking. Thank you very much. We have we're living in our same old big old house that we've been in for 50 years or whatever it is, and we're fine. My wife is way ahead of things like that. She knows a lot about medicine and science. When she started to hear about this in January, there were rumors out. The only person who missed it was the guy at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, but he's got more important things to do, like kiting money for himself and his friends. But my wife said there's something wrong. We've got to be careful, and she was already saying, maybe we won't go to this restaurant or do that, or be careful on the subway. Remember to wash your hands when you're going to have lunch with your friends. And I got to the point where by February she's saying, this is real. This is coming out of Wuhan, China, and blah 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 blah. So we've been in for essentially since mid-February. Went shopping at Costco one day, and she said, this place is too crowded and people out shopping like they know something. And so we've been in. So thank you. We're fine. We have 3 kids. They all have great spouses, and we have 5 grandchildren. All of them are healthy. All of them are observing. One I hope is she's not living at home right now. But the fact is, we've had we're lucky, we're blessed, and everybody takes it seriously. Nobody's being a cowboy or a cowgirl that I know about. Well,
we certainly are happy to hear that, and we certainly appreciate you spending some time with us and remembering a legend of baseball, despite him not ever making the major leagues. George Vescey, former New York Times sports columnist, and more importantly, at least for this show and for this host, a fellow Hofstra University alum. Sir, we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Go Hofstra.
It's George Vescey, legendary New York Times sports writer, and we were so grateful to have him on and be able to talk with him here this week on the show. And as always, we thank you guys for being a part of the show. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, review, share us with your friends and family. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, on Google and Apple Play, Spreaker.com, Stitcher.com, iHeartRadio, and of course, publichousemedia.org. And check us out on social media. Be a part of the show by submitting questions. You can check us out on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just search Caught Listening by Public House Media, or email the show, caughtlisteningphm@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter as well, at Chris Heimel, ChrisHeimall. month of May, we're going to do something fun. It's going to be the month of the fan. We're going to talk about the best traditions, the worst traditions, the best experiences, and all that great stuff. If you want to be a part of the show, you know how. Just find us on social media. Caught Listening by Public House Media. Till next week, I'm Christian Heimel, and you have been caught listening.